The town's mockery turned their path into one where 1 in 10 survived a ravine fall, and desert mountain thirst killed in 2 days without a drop. Their tale is full of blood from bites and breaks, where 9 travelers out of 10 lay forever. Stay to learn how despair forges a legend from pain. The sun hung low over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the dusty trail where Caleb trudged with a deer carcass slung over his shoulder. He was a mountain man, broad as an oak, with hands calloused from years of trapping and skinning in the wilds of the Wyoming territory. His boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the settlement of Redstone, a cluster of wooden shacks and a saloon that barely passed for civilization. Caleb didn't talk much. Words were a waste when the wind and wolves spoke clearer. He'd survived blizzards, bear attacks, and starvation where weaker men would have crumbled. Folks in Redstone called him a savage, their whispers sharp as a blade when he hauled his furs to trade. In the saloon, men leaned over chipped mugs, their laughter cutting through the smoky air. "Look at Caleb, the mountain beast," one sneered, his voice thick with whiskey. "Thinks he's king of the hills, but he's just dirt and beard." Caleb stood at the counter, trading pelts for salt and bullets, his gray eyes steady, ignoring the jabs. He'd heard it all before. His rough clothes, his silence, his life alone in the wild made him a target. But he didn't care. The mountains didn't judge, and neither did he. Then came Eliza. She stepped into Redstone one spring morning, her fine dress catching dust as she climbed from a stagecoach. A city woman, rich from her father's cattle empire, she turned heads and tongues. Nobody understood why she stayed, least of all when she chose Caleb. Their marriage was a slap to the town's face. At the small church, folks gathered not to celebrate, but to gawk. "She's throwing herself away," a woman hissed, her fan snapping shut. "Marrying a man who smells like pine and blood." Eliza held her chin high, her green eyes fierce, but Caleb saw the tremor in her hands as they exchanged vows. He didn't speak of love, not out loud. His proposal had been simple, almost gruff, under a cottonwood tree. "I ain't much, but I'll keep you safe." She'd nodded, her smile soft but determined, like she was staking a claim on him against the world. The town's scorn grew louder after that day. Shopkeepers shortchanged him. Men spat in his path. Eliza faced it too. Women snubbed her at the general store, their voices dripping with pity and venom. Caleb's silence grew heavier, his jaw tight as he carried their supplies home. Something was brewing, a storm bigger than the mountains he called home. The Redstone saloon buzzed with gossip as Caleb and Eliza walked past, her arm looped through his. Dust clung to his worn boots, while her silk dress caught the late afternoon sun, making her look like she belonged in a city parlor, not this rough patch of dirt. The townsfolk didn't hold back. "She's a fool, tying herself to that wild man," muttered a shopkeeper, sweeping his porch with a smirk. A group of women near the church whispered loud enough for Eliza to hear, their words sharp as cactus spines. "Rich girl playing at love with a bear." Caleb's face stayed hard as stone, but his gray eyes flickered, catching every jab. Eliza kept her head high, her shoulders squared, but her fingers tightened on Caleb's arm. Back home, in her father's mansion, she'd faced polite smiles and veiled insults, but this was raw, unfiltered scorn. At the general store, a woman bumped her shoulder, muttering, "You'll regret leaving your kind for his." Eliza's breath hitched, her chest heavy with the weight of their judgment. She wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't understand the man who'd promised her a life built on trust, not gold. But she bit her lip, tasting the salt of her own restraint. Caleb didn't speak as they left the store, his arms loaded with flour and salt. His silence wasn't new. He'd always let the mountains do his talking. But now it felt different, like a storm gathering behind his eyes. At their small cabin, Eliza set the table, her hands shaking as she placed tin plates. "They don't know you," she said, her voice low, almost a plea. "They don't see what I see." Caleb paused, his knife halfway through carving a hunk of venison. "They see what they want," he said, his words rough but steady. "Let 'em talk. It don't change us." But it did. Eliza saw it in the way his jaw clenched when a man spat near their path, in the way he checked the rifle by the door each night. He wasn't just fighting the town's words. He was fighting for her, for them. His silence wasn't weakness. It was a promise, a fire kindling in his chest. Eliza felt it too, her pride battling the ache of being shunned. She'd chosen him, this man who smelled of pine and knew the wild like a brother. The townsfolk could laugh, but Caleb's steady gaze told her he'd prove them wrong, not with words, but with something fiercer. As the sun dipped below the peaks, casting their cabin in shadow, Eliza wondered what that proof would cost. Caleb led the way, his boots scraping against the rocky trail that wound through the Wyoming mountains. The sun beat down, turning the air thick and heavy, dust sticking to their sweat-soaked clothes. Eliza followed, her city shoes slipping on loose stones, her breath short from the climb. They'd left Redstone at dawn, the town's jeers still ringing in their ears, hoping the wild would give them space to breathe. The path was unforgiving. Narrow ledges hugged steep cliffs, and the only water was a trickle in a leather canteen Caleb rationed like gold. He moved with purpose, his broad frame steady despite the weight of their supplies. Eliza's world had been velvet curtains and polished tables, not this endless stretch of rock and thorn. She stumbled, her hand scraping against a jagged boulder, and cursed under her breath. The mountains didn't care about her wealth or her pride. They demanded strength she wasn't sure she had. Caleb glanced back, his gray eyes sharp but patient. "Watch the ground, not the sky," he said, his voice low, cutting through the wind's howl. He knelt by a patch of scrubby plants, showing her how to spot edible herbs, bitter greens that could keep hunger at bay. "These'll save you when the meat runs out," he added, his rough fingers brushing the leaves. She tried to mimic him, her hands clumsy but determined, pulling up roots that smelled of earth and survival. The silence out here was different from Redstone's cruel whispers. It was vast, heavy, like the mountains were listening. Caleb taught her to hear it. The rustle of a distant deer, the shift of pebbles underfoot. "Nature speaks if you shut up long enough," he said, his words blunt, but carrying a truth she felt in her bones. Eliza's heart pounded, not just from the heat or the climb, but from realizing how small she was against this wild land. The sun climbed higher, baking the trail until their throats burned for water. Caleb handed her the canteen, letting her sip first, though his lips were cracked and dry. She saw the weight he carried, not just their gear, but the need to keep her alive in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. Her fine dress was torn now, her hands blistered, but she kept moving, driven by his steady pace. The mountains were a test, and Caleb was her guide. His lessons simple but brutal: survive or don't. As dusk painted the cliffs red, Eliza felt the wild seeping into her, stripping away the woman she'd been, leaving something raw and untested in its place. Night fell hard on the mountain trail, the moon barely a sliver above the craggy peaks. Caleb and Eliza camped in a shallow hollow, the fire's glow casting shadows on the rocks. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something wilder, something hungry. Caleb's rifle rested across his knees as he scanned the darkness, his breath steady but his eyes alert. Eliza huddled close to the fire, her hands gripping a tin mug, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in her bones. Then it came, a low growl followed by glinting eyes in the black beyond the firelight. Wolves. A pack, lean and bold, drawn by the smell of their meager supplies. Caleb stood, his silhouette broad against the flames, and shouted, "Stay back!" His voice was a thunderclap, but the wolves didn't flinch. They lunged, teeth flashing, a blur of gray fur and snarls. Caleb swung his rifle like a club, cracking one wolf's skull, then fired, the shot echoing off the cliffs. Blood sprayed, but another beast clamped onto his arm, tearing through his coat. He roared, driving his knife into its side, but more came, their howls splitting the night. Eliza screamed, her body frozen, her hands clutching the mug like it could save her. "Do something," Caleb yelled, his voice raw as he wrestled a wolf off his leg, blood soaking his pants. Eliza stumbled forward, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. She swung it wildly, sparks flying, singeing a wolf's flank. It yelped and retreated, but her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. Fear choked her, fear of the wolves, of losing Caleb, of this wild place that didn't care if they lived or died. She dropped to her knees beside him as the last wolf fled, its tail low. Caleb's chest heaved, his arm and leg torn, blood pooling in the dirt. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling as she ripped her shawl to bind his wounds. Her hands shook, useless against the mess of blood and torn flesh. Dawn broke gray and cold, the fire reduced to ash. Caleb leaned against a rock, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Eliza's eyes burned with tears she wouldn't let fall. They'd survived, but at a cost. Caleb's strength, the one thing that had carried them this far, was slipping away. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, her fingers lingering on his rough skin. "We're still here," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing her insides. Caleb's eyes met hers, pain etched deep, but he nodded. The wolves were gone, but the trail ahead loomed, and Eliza knew the real fight was just beginning. The trail twisted higher into the Wyoming mountains, each step a battle against loose rocks and blistering heat. Caleb limped, his arm and leg bandaged from the wolf attack, blood staining the torn cloth. Eliza followed close, her blistered hands gripping a stick for balance, her torn dress dragging in the dust. The air was thin, the sun relentless, and their canteen hung nearly empty at Caleb's side. They hadn't spoken much since dawn, saving strength for the climb. Then it happened. Eliza's foot caught a slick stone. She stumbled, arms flailing, and tumbled over the edge into a narrow ravine, her screams slicing through the silence. She hit the ground hard, rocks biting into her back, her left leg snapping under her weight. Pain exploded, white-hot, stealing her breath. She clutched her leg, feeling the bone's wrong angle, her gasps turning to sobs. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice raw, echoing off the ravine's walls. Up above, Caleb dropped to his knees at the edge, his face pale, blood still seeping from his shoulder, where a wolf's teeth had torn deep. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, but his eyes locked on her, fierce and unyielding. He tied their rope around a boulder, ignoring the fire in his wounds, and slid down to her. Every move cost him. His arm trembled, blood dripped onto the rocks, but he didn't stop. "Hold on," he said, his voice gruff but steady, like he was commanding the mountain itself. He knelt beside her, his rough hands gentle as he checked her leg. Eliza winced, tears streaming, the pain so fierce she thought she'd pass out. Caleb tore a strip from his shirt, binding her leg to a stick for support. "You're getting out of here," he said, no room for doubt in his tone. He looped the rope under her arms, his own strength fading, and started to climb, pulling her inch by inch. His shoulder bled fresh, his breaths were gasps, but he hauled her up, muscles straining against the weight. Eliza clung to the rope, her broken legs screaming with every jolt. At the top, Caleb collapsed beside her, chest heaving, sweat mixing with blood on his face. "You're alive," he panted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza reached for his hand, her fingers shaking, and squeezed. The pain in her leg throbbed, but his grip anchored her. They lay there, two broken figures, on a merciless trail, the mountains watching in silence. Caleb's resolve hadn't wavered, but his body was betraying him, and Eliza knew they were running out of time. The mountain trail stretched on, a cruel ribbon of dust and stone under a sky that offered no mercy. Eliza lay propped against a boulder, her broken leg throbbing, the makeshift splint doing little to ease the pain. Caleb sat beside her, his shoulder wound, seeping through the bandage, his face gray with exhaustion. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood, their canteen empty, the sun burning their skin. Eliza's eyes traced the lines of Caleb's face, hard, weathered, but softer now, like he was holding something back. For the first time, she saw him not as the mountain man who'd swept her away, but as someone who'd bleed out for her without a second thought. She shifted, wincing as pain shot through her leg. "Caleb," she said, her voice hoarse, "you're killing yourself for me." Her words hung heavy, raw with the weight of their situation. She'd left a life of silk dresses and silver spoons, but out here, those meant nothing. Caleb's sacrifice, his blood, his strength, was worth more than her father's fortune. He looked at her, his gray eyes steady despite the pain etching his face. "Why?" she pressed, her voice breaking. "Why do you keep going when it's tearing you apart?" Caleb leaned back, his breath ragged, his hand resting on the rifle across his lap. "They laughed at us, Eliza," he said, his voice low but fierce, like a fire smoldering in his chest. "Back in Redstone, they called me a savage, you a fool. They'll only laugh while we're alive." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "Legends don't get laughed at." The words hit her hard, like a stone dropped in still water. He wasn't just fighting for her life. He was fighting for their story, for something bigger than the town's scorn. Eliza's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She'd chosen him for his strength, his quiet honesty, but now she saw the depth of it. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice trembling with guilt and awe. "All I brought you was trouble." Caleb shook his head, his hand finding hers, rough but warm. "You brought me a reason," he said, his words simple but heavy. "That's enough." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. Eliza squeezed his hand, her heart aching with the truth of his words. Out here, stripped of wealth and pride, she understood what mattered. Him, them, this brutal love that kept them moving forward despite the pain. The Wyoming sun scorched the earth, turning the mountain trail into a furnace of dust and cracked stone. Caleb stumbled forward, Eliza slung across his back, her broken leg dangling, each jolt sending pain through her body. His own wounds, torn shoulder, gashed leg, bled through their bandages, staining his shirt a dull red. The canteen hung empty at his side, their lips cracked, throats burning with thirst. The air shimmered with heat, the mountains silent except for the crunch of Caleb's boots and his labored breathing. Eliza clung to his shoulders, her hands weak but desperate, feeling the tremble in his frame. Every step was a fight. Caleb's legs buckled under Eliza's weight, but he caught himself, his jaw clenched tight. "Keep going," he muttered, more to himself than her, his voice rough as gravel. The trail stretched endless, a cruel line of rock and scrub that offered no shade, no mercy. Eliza's head rested against his neck, her breath hot and shallow. She wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, but she knew he wouldn't. His stubbornness, that quiet fire she'd seen in his eyes back in Redstone, drove him now. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proving something, to her, to himself, to the world that had laughed them down. The heat pressed harder, dust coating their faces, stinging their eyes. Eliza's leg throbbed, each movement a stab of pain, but she bit her lip, refusing to cry out. Caleb's strength was fading. She felt it in the way his steps slowed, the way his shoulders sagged. Yet he carried her, his arms locked under her, his back slick with sweat and blood. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, cracked from thirst. Caleb didn't answer, just took another step, then another, his boots scraping the ground like a man defying death itself. A distant ridge loomed, promising a river if they could reach it. Caleb's eyes fixed on it, his breath a ragged rhythm. Eliza tightened her grip, her fingers digging into his coat. She thought of Redstone, the sneers, the whispers, and how small they seemed now against this man who carried her through hell. Each step was a choice, a rebellion against the mountains, against fate, against the idea that they'd fail. The sun climbed higher, the world blurring into heat and pain, but Caleb kept moving, his body a shield, his will a weapon. Eliza pressed her face to his shoulder, whispering, "Don't stop." She didn't know if he heard, but his next step answered her. The trail dipped toward a dry creek bed, dust swirling around Caleb's boots as he carried Eliza, her broken leg limp against his side. His shoulder bled through its bandage, his steps uneven, each one a battle against collapse. The sun hung low, painting the rocks orange, but offered no relief from the heat choking their lungs. Eliza's face was pale, her lips cracked, pain etched in every line. Then hooves thundered in the distance. 3 riders appeared, men in fine coats, their horses sleek, a stark contrast to the battered pair. Eliza tensed, recognizing them. Thomas, her father's business partner, and 2 of his lackeys, men who'd sneered at her wedding in Redstone. Thomas dismounted, his boots polished despite the dust, his smile sharp as a knife. "Eliza, you look half dead," he said, his voice dripping with pity. "This is what comes of running off with a savage." His men chuckled, their eyes raking over Caleb, who stood silent, Eliza still in his arms. Thomas stepped closer, his tone softening, manipulative. "Come with us. We've got water, a doctor, a proper life. Leave this man to his mountains. The offer hung heavy, promising safety but demanding she betray Caleb, the one who'd carried her through hell. Eliza's heart pounded, her leg throbbing with every breath. She remembered their laughter, their whispers that she'd thrown her life away. Pain and fear clawed at her, tempting her to take the easy way out, but she looked at Caleb, his gray eyes steady, his face worn but unyielding, blood and sweat marking his sacrifice. "No," she said, her voice low, firm, cutting through the tension. "I'm not leaving him. Not for you, not for anything." The words burned her throat, but they felt like freedom, a choice made not from wealth, but from something deeper. Thomas's face hardened, his men shifting in their saddles, but they didn't argue. Caleb said nothing, his silence louder than any words. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw pride flicker there, a quiet fire that said she'd chosen right. He adjusted his grip, his arms trembling but refusing to falter, and turned away from the riders. The men muttered, their horses snorting as they rode off, leaving dust in their wake. Eliza leaned into Caleb's shoulder, her pain sharper but her resolve stronger. The trail stretched on, merciless, but her choice was a weight lifted, a bond forged in defiance. Caleb's silence spoke of trust, and she knew they'd face whatever came next together. The mountain trail seemed to mock them, its rocks sharp underfoot, the air heavy with dust and heat. Caleb staggered, Eliza still in his arms, his face ashen, blood soaking his bandages from the wolf attack. His breaths were shallow gasps, his steps faltering until his knees buckled, and he collapsed into the dirt, Eliza tumbling beside him. Her broken legs screamed with pain, the splint barely holding, but she crawled to him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. "Caleb, stay with me," she pleaded, her voice cracking, raw with fear. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, his body limp under the weight of his wounds. Eliza's heart pounded, panic clawing her chest. The river was close. She could hear its faint rush beyond the ridge, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. Her leg throbbed, useless, but she gritted her teeth, dragging herself upright. She grabbed Caleb's arms, her hands slipping in his blood, and pulled. He was heavy, a dead weight, his rifle sliding into the dust. Each tug sent fire through her leg, her cries echoing off the cliffs, desperate and sharp. "You're not dying on me," she hissed, her voice fierce, a confession of love and defiance to the mountains that wanted them dead. Inch by inch she dragged him, her broken leg trailing, scraping against rocks. Sweat stung her eyes, her breath ragged, but she kept moving, fueled by something deeper than pain. The river's sound grew louder, a promise of life if she could just get there. Her hands bled, torn by the rough ground, but she gripped Caleb tighter, his shallow breaths her only guide. "Come on," she gasped, her voice breaking as tears mixed with dust on her face. Every pull was a battle, her body screaming to stop, but stopping meant losing him, and that wasn't an option. The riverbank appeared, its water glinting under the fading sun. Eliza collapsed beside it, pulling Caleb's head to the edge. She scooped water with trembling hands, splashing it over his face, his lips praying it would bring him back. "Wake up," she sobbed, her voice a mix of desperation and rage. His chest rose slightly, a faint sign he was still fighting. Eliza's leg burned, her strength gone, but she'd done it, dragged him to salvation. Each cry, each agonizing step, had been a testament to her will. A woman who'd once known only wealth, now proving her heart was stronger. The river flowed on, indifferent, as Eliza held Caleb, refusing to let go. The river's edge was a lifeline, its cool water lapping at the rocks where Eliza knelt beside Caleb. His chest rose weakly, his face pale, the wounds from the wolves crusted with blood and dirt. Eliza's broken leg throbbed, her hands raw from dragging him, but she'd kept him alive. Days blurred as she tended him, using river water and herbs he'd taught her to clean his wounds. Caleb's eyes opened on the third day, cloudy but stubborn, his voice a rasp. "You didn't let me go." Eliza's heart clenched. She'd fought for him, and he'd fought back, their bond stronger than the mountains that tried to break them. Her old life, silk dresses, grand houses, felt like a ghost now. She looked at Caleb, his scarred arm, his steady gaze, and knew no amount of gold could match what he'd given her. a reason to keep going. Her wealth had bought her nothing out here. It was Caleb's strength, his quiet love, that mattered. She tore another strip from her tattered dress to rebind his shoulder, her fingers steady despite the pain in her leg. "You're worth more than all of it," she said, her voice low, a confession meant for him alone. He squeezed her hand, too weak to speak, but his eyes said enough. Their return to Redstone was slow, Caleb limping, Eliza leaning on a crude crutch he'd carved. The town's dirt streets were the same, but the air felt different. People stopped outside the saloon, their eyes wide, no longer sneering. The shopkeeper who'd called Caleb a savage stood silent, his broom still. A woman who'd mocked Eliza at the store stepped back, her face pale, as if seeing ghosts. Word had spread, whispers of wolves, a ravine, a woman dragging her man to a river. They weren't laughing now. Fear and respect replaced the scorn, their stares heavy as Caleb and Eliza passed, his arm around her for support. The cabin they called home waited at the edge of town, its wooden walls a quiet refuge. Eliza helped Caleb inside, her legs still aching, his scars a map of their survival. The town's silence followed them, a weight that felt like victory. They'd faced death and walked away, not as a rich woman and a mountain man, but as something more. Partners who'd carved their own path. Eliza lit a fire, its warmth pushing back the chill. Caleb watched her, his voice rough but clear. "They see us now." She nodded, knowing Redstone's whispers had changed, their story already outgrowing the town's small minds. Night settled over Redstone, the glow of campfires dotting the outskirts where folks gathered, their voices low, carried by the crisp Wyoming air. The saloon's chatter had shifted, no longer sharp with scorn, but heavy with something else, awe, maybe fear. Around one fire, a trapper leaned forward, his hands rough from years of skinning, and spoke of Caleb and Eliza. They faced wolves, tore through the night like demons, he said, his words painting a picture of blood and snarls. Another man, his face weathered, added, "She fell in a ravine, broke her leg, but dragged him to the river." The listeners leaned in, eyes wide, the crackle of the fire underscoring their tale. No one spoke of the old days when Redstone's tongues wagged with mockery, calling Caleb a savage, Eliza a fool for choosing him. Those words had burned away, replaced by a story that grew taller with each telling. A woman stirred the fire, sparks rising, and said, "He carried her, bleeding, through the mountains." She wouldn't leave him, not even for her old life. The crowd nodded, their faces lit by flickering light, seeing not just a mountain man and a rich girl, but something bigger, a pair who'd defied death itself. The tale wasn't about wealth or status. It was about grit, love, and survival. In the hills, other fires burned. Other voices carried the story. A boy, barely old enough to hold a rifle, listened as his father recounted the ravine, the wolves, the river. "They didn't break," the father said, his voice firm, like he was passing down a truth. The legend spread beyond Redstone, whispered in trading posts, sung in Selweens farther out. No one mentioned the sneers, the shopkeepers' jabs, or the women's cruel whispers. Those had crumbled, too small to stand against the weight of what Caleb and Eliza had done. Their story was a fire of its own, burning brighter than any rich man's house or fleeting town gossip. By their cabin, Caleb and Eliza sat, unaware of the tales weaving through the night. The firelight danced on their faces, scarred and worn, but alive. Eliza's leg was healing slow, Caleb's wounds leaving marks he'd carry forever. Yet their hands touched, a quiet promise that outlasted the mountain's cruelty. The stories told around those fires weren't just about survival. They were about a love that clawed its way through blood and dust, a strength that silenced doubters. Redstone's people didn't laugh anymore. They listened, passing the legend on, letting it grow until it was bigger than the town, bigger than them all. The Wyoming wind carried a chill as Caleb sat outside their cabin, sharpening his knife by the fire's glow. His scars, jagged lines across his shoulder and leg, told a story of wolves and survival, but his gray eyes held the same quiet strength as always. Eliza limped nearby, her legs still stiff, her fine dresses long gone, replaced by rough cotton that matched the dust of Redstone. She'd traded her father's wealth for this life, and not once did she look back. Their cabin, small and weathered, stood as proof of what they'd built. Not with money, but with something tougher, something that lasted. Redstone had changed. The saloon still buzzed, but the whispers now carried their names with a weight that silenced mockery. Caleb and Eliza weren't just a mountain man and a city woman anymore. They were a legend, their story etched into the town like carvings in stone. Folks spoke of them with reverence, their tale a reminder that loyalty and grit outshine gold. They faced death and won, a trader said one night, his voice low over a whiskey glass. That's what matters. Eliza overheard it once, her heart swelling, not with pride but with a hard-earned truth. Love and honor don't fade like wealth does. Caleb never cared for the talk. He hunted, trapped, lived by the mountain's rules, same as always. But when he looked at Eliza, tending the fire or mending a shirt, he saw the woman who'd dragged him to a river, who'd chosen him over a soft life. She saw it too. The man who'd carried her through hell, who'd fought for their story when the world laughed. Their hands, scarred and calloused, fit together like they were made for it. Redstone's people learned from them, their story a mirror held up to the town's smallness, showing what strength really meant. As winter crept closer, the fires of Redstone burned bright, and their tales spread farther, across trading posts, into distant Salueans. It wasn't about riches or power, but about two people who'd faced the wild and come out whole. Wealth could build a mansion, but it crumbled under time. Love and honor, like Caleb and Eliza's, built something eternal. Their names carried a truth that stuck, a lesson for anyone who listened. What you fight for, who you hold close, that's what endures. The mountains stood witness, silent and unchanging as their story lived on louder than any fortune. And that's how it happened.